Hello, this is Robin Dennison. This is Module 10 of 628, which is related to evaluation of learning outcomes. And this particular module is more of an overview in terms of evaluation of learning outcomes. So we'll be talking a little bit in this module about tests, but we'll be talking also about non-test options. And then also, very importantly, the difference between summative and formative evaluation. So the objectives for this particular model: to describe the interrelatedness of assessment and evaluation, to differentiate between formative and summative evaluation, and I know we've already talked about that a bit, discuss the concepts of validity and reliability as they relate to evaluation of learning outcomes, differentiate between criterion reference tests and norm reference tests, and then to be able to match assessment strategies to domains of learning, and then also to talk about or discuss the advantages and disadvantages of selected strategies for assessment evaluation of learning outcomes. So first of all, this term assessment and evaluation. Many times you will hear these used interchangeably, and actually in certain books that you're going to be reading with your assignments, they may even say from the beginning, you know, we're going to use these terms interchangeably. Assessment, though, is much more like formative evaluation. It is certainly not summative evaluation. So when we talk about assessment, we're talking about obtaining information for a specific purpose, like sometimes that's to see if you're getting through. And then the purpose is to understand and improve student learning. It may be quantitative or qualitative, and it is also known as formative evaluation. So it's a process of determining progress with the goal of really making improvements in your teaching to improve better outcomes for your students, for your learners. And then evaluation means that judgments are made about the value or quality of performance at some endpoint. What endpoint might that be? That might certainly be the end of a module. It also might be the end of a certain time period, like for instance, a lot of times we do evaluations at midterm and then again at the end. So either at some endpoint within the course or at the end of the course. And evaluation is to assign a grade and a decision. It involves certainly a decision for a course grade. So summative evaluation is where grading comes in. Formative evaluation, which again may be referred to as assessment, is your formative evaluation to try to look at progress and how well you're doing in terms of having the student achieve what you want them to achieve. So this is a slide you've seen before, and it is just to again remind you that summative evaluation is assessment of learning and formative evaluation is assessment for learning. So again, to kind of incrementally see how we're doing in terms of assisting the learner in achieving the learning outcomes that we desire. So formative versus summative. Again, formative is how are you doing, and summative is how did you do. And so it, I guess I always think about formative as how are you doing, and that is the teacher as well as the student. And do modifications need to be made to allow the student to be doing better? So it occurs during the process of learning. It's looking at progression and progress in a course, and it directs learning to achieve the objectives that you've set up or the outcomes that you've set up. And it's really to provide feedback, and no grades are intended to be assigned in response to a formative assessment, formative evaluation. Summative evaluation, on the other hand, is at the completion of instruction, and it summarizes a student's achievement in a course. And the purpose of it, of course, is to provide feedback and assign grades. Measurement versus evaluation. And I apologize for all these versus slides, but there are so many of these terms that have so much overlap that it's important that we kind of talk about what one means versus the other means. So measurement is the process of assigning a score that represents a degree to which either some trait or characteristic or behavior is associated with an individual. So it has to do with testing and ratings and observations. And objectivity in that measurement is essential. And one of the ways that we increase objectivity in measurement in non-test assignments is, of course, the development of rubrics. And we'll be talking a lot more about that in Module 13. Evaluation, on the other hand, is a value judgment that attaches meaning to that data that you obtained in the measurement process. And it's guided by judgment. And it compares the student's performance with the standard that you've set. So, for instance, if I talk about a rubric, the rubric is the tool of measurement. It is the standard. What I always say is, you want to stay on the full points column. And so that full points column is, of course, the exemplar standard that we want students to achieve. And so evaluation also is making a decision based on that comparison of where this student is with the standard. Do they meet standard? Are they below the standard? Do they exceed the standard? So let's talk about measurement tools or measurement instruments for just a bit. And these are the steps in terms of identifying effective measurements. The first thing you always have to do is establish your objectives and your learning outcomes. And that is, what do you expect the student to be able to take away at the end of this module, at the end of this particular course? The next thing you're going to do is develop a blueprint based on the course content and those objectives. And I have certainly participated in courses, not design courses, but participated in courses where the test items seem to have absolutely no relationship to the objectives. And that is, in my opinion, very poor teaching. So you need to know what the objectives are, and then the evaluation has to be geared toward those objectives. In my opinion, students need to be able to look at those objectives before an exam and say, yep, I'm ready. Or, wow, I really need to focus more on that objective and that objective and that objective. So when students ask me for study guides, for instance, for an exam, my comment is always, well, look at the objectives. The objectives are your study guide. Create items to measure the mastery of the content and the objectives, and that's you writing test questions, for instance, or designing tools. And then finally, quantify the results of the measurement. Validity and reliability. We often talk about the validity and reliability of various and sundry tools. So for instance, when we talk about validity, that means that the tool actually verifies that the faculty are in fact, or I'll say the teacher is in fact, collecting and analyzing the results that they intend to measure. And so again, if I have a tool, a test, that is developed without making sure that they're reflective of those objectives, then that is certainly not a valid tool. Is the assessment technique appropriate to the purpose, and does it provide useful and meaningful data? And certainly there are objectives, and we'll talk about those, that you cannot measure with an objective exam. You have to use other methods of evaluation. On the other hand, if you're talking about things like discuss, describe, list, those are certainly things that can be evaluated through an objective exam. Reliability is the extent to which the instrument is dependable, concise, predictable, and consistent. We often talk about inter-rater reliability, and that is, for instance, if I have multiple teachers evaluating an assignment, and I have a rubric developed for them to all use to evaluate that assignment. If I give a paper to one teacher and the same paper to another teacher, I ideally should be able to, if the tool is truly reliable, I should be able to get the same score from both of those teachers in response to a particular written assignment, for instance. This is the point there that says note is a quote from Billings and Halstead, and I really like this, and so forgive me for reading it to you. A multiplicity of assessment strategies can provide a more complete picture of the student's abilities and therefore contribute to the trustworthiness of the assessment process. One of the things that I never like to see is a course where the entire evaluation process is through exams. And that is that we need to have various and sundry ways to look at it. You know, we could kind of talk about it as triangulation, so to speak. And that is, if we evaluate students in a variety of ways, then that certainly improves, again, according to Billings and Halstead, the trustworthiness of that assessment process. So in selecting strategies for the evaluation of student learning outcomes, the first thing is to assess and evaluate all the domains of learning. And that won't necessarily occur in all courses, but certainly as we look at cognitive, we want to look at higher levels of cognitive domain. There are certainly courses where you want to focus on the psychomotor domain, and there are courses where you really want to focus on certainly the affective domain. We want to be able to assess critical thinking, and we've talked about how to do that in the past. And we certainly do want to prepare our undergraduate students for NCLEX, and we want to prepare our graduate students for their advanced practice certification exams. So let's talk first about tests. Tests are measurement instruments, and they are intended to give us data so that we can make decisions about the student's performance, and we want tests that do that with a minimum amount of error. So we do want valid exams that do reflect what our desire is in terms of outcomes. There are two major categories of tests. One is criterion referenced, and the other is norm referenced. And if you talk about criterion referenced tests, then those tests actually interpret the student's raw score using a preset standard established by the faculty. So we have a grading scale, right? And that is, if you score between 93 and 100, it's an A. If you score between 90 and 93, 92.9, then it's an A minus, and so on. That's a percent score when we look at criterion reference tests. Norm reference tests are going to compare a student's achievement with the achievement of the peer group. And so a lot of times people talk about this as kind of grading on a curve, so to speak, and that is that the score is adjusted according to how everybody else did. Typically this is a percentile score. So for instance, if you scored the highest on this test, the highest in your group, then obviously you scored a 99 percentile because 99 of the students were below you. It's not concerned with the level of individuals, the individual students' achievement. It's related to how they are in relationship to everyone. So you can see how scary that would be in terms of patient safety. And that is, if you say, well, gee, everybody did really bad on this test. I think it was a valid test, but everybody did really badly. So I'm going to go ahead and say, well, let's curve these. And the best student, gosh, she only got about a 59, but okay, she's going to be a 99 percentile. Oh, wow, that's really troublesome, isn't it, if you think about it that way? And that is, if you have a valid test and then you go with norm referencing, then that means that you're basically saying, well, our students didn't do very well. They really don't have it in relationship to the objectives in this particular course, this particular content. But, she did the best, he did the best, and we'll go from there. So obviously you can tell that norm reference tests are not really what we would want to use, especially in a profession where patient safety is so crucial to our graduates' performance. So some important points. Using a single test or type of measurement instrument is not a satisfactory assessment strategy. Most course objectives are going to require, I'll say if you have the whole group of course objectives, they're going to require a variety of measurement and evaluation strategies to determine student competency. And we want to be able to match the objective with the most appropriate way to do that measurement. The selection of instruments depends on the outcome to be measured, and the most important strategies for measuring learning outcomes should be selected, which means that, again, if you have things like list, describe, identify, those are things that are going to be easily evaluated with an objective test. On the other hand, if you say something like develop or design, those are not going to be assessed with an objective test, with an examination. So again, the evaluation methods must match the objectives. So select, identify, describe. Yeah, you can test that. Write, compose, develop. Those are ones that you certainly cannot use in an exam. So the challenges of using non-exam evaluation methods, and there are a lot of them, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of times teachers kind of slip back to, well, we'll just use tests, is first of all, it takes a lot of time to develop the strategy. It takes a lot of time to develop the tools that are going to be used to evaluate that particular strategy. So for instance, in this course, you all can just imagine as you look at the rubrics for your presentation and for your course design, how much time it took me to develop those particular rubrics. So it is very time consuming, and developing evaluation rubrics is not easy. And we'll be spending quite a bit of time during Module 13 on how to do that. So some guidelines. And these are guidelines that were listed in Billings and Halstead, so I'll just remind you to be sure to review these. Identifying the purpose of the assessment, or the particular evaluation method. Where is it going to take place? What is the best evaluation strategy for that particular assignment? What's a procedure for the strategy? Like, how are people going to do it? What are the guidelines? Give students instructions. Establish validity and reliability of the evaluation strategy, which might mean the rubric. And then finally, afterward, evaluate the overall effectiveness of that whole process, but also especially the rubric, because there are many times when you're going to have to revise the rubric. So multiple methods is described by Billings and Halstead, and there's a whole table on these multiple methods of evaluation and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each. And I encourage you to spend some time with that particular table. And when you make these kind of assignments, you really have to have a complete description of not only how you want the assignment completed, how you want it submitted, when you want it submitted, and how it's going to be evaluated. And I love this little quote I found. That's I really don't know who Rick Stiggins is, but I did really love this quote, and that is that students can hit any target that they know about and that stands still for them. And so that's why it's so important to develop a rubric and make sure that the students know what that target is from the very beginning with non-exam assessment methods. So, some common evaluation methods. Obviously, tests are always at the top of this list because they're objective as long as the items are well written. They're consistent. They're numeric. You know, there's a number there that you can say, oh, well, you know, no one's going to argue with me about what they got on this exam. They may argue with me about items, but they're not going to say, you know, that I was subjective. And that's one of the things that instructors like about tests. Again, they may not like the items, but they know that their score is the same. If they answer the questions exactly like someone else did, then they know that they got the same score as that other person. With written exams, they don't always know that, and so they're always concerned about subjectivity, students are. So written assignments, some examples of those would be discussion board questions, if you're talking about online, journals, like your self-reflective journals, for instance, and various and sundry scholarly papers, including experiential learning, like you're participating in, with your course design. Presentations would be another evaluation method. Portfolios, and we'll be talking a lot about portfolios. And then also concept maps would be another example of it, a written method of evaluation. I'll say written and graphic method to be used for evaluation. So we've talked about different types of evaluation, summative versus formative. We talked about what evaluation is versus what measurement is, what assessment is versus what evaluation is. We've talked about different types of tests, whether criterion referenced or norm referenced. And then we've also talked about these, I'll call them non-exam methods of evaluation that are so important in giving variety to the way in which we evaluate students.